The water was black and cold, and it had been holding her for 11 hours. Staff Sergeant Theodora Vashon pressed her back against the ancient stone of the canal wall, her rifle raised above the surface, her body screaming for warmth it would not receive. Somewhere above her, beyond the bridge, the checkpoint lights flickered against the pre-dawn sky. 14 hours earlier, she had stood in a briefing room at Forward Operating Base Copperhead, listening to a man explain why she would fail. Before we continue with this story, drop a comment and let us know what state or country you're watching from. Maybe you know someone who has faced impossible odds like the ones Teddy Vashon was about to confront. Chief Warrant Officer Bryce Haggerty had not looked at her when he spoke. He addressed Captain Aldretti as though Teddy were not standing 3 feet away, as though her 17 months of combat deployments and her record-setting marksmanship scores existed in some parallel universe that did not intersect with his own. The target is a Mod Casser, Haggerty said, pointing to the satellite image on the screen. He runs the checkpoint at Aurashad. Intel confirms he is responsible for the IED cell that killed 3 of our people last month. The window for elimination is narrow. He appears at dawn for morning prayer, exposed for approximately 90 seconds. Captain Jimena already studied the image. And the infiltration route? Haggerty traced a line with his finger. Ottomanera Canal system runs directly beneath a stone bridge 40 meters from the checkpoint. A sniper in position, there would have clear line of sight. Teddy watched the route on the screen, already calculating entry points, current speed, concealment options. She had grown up in Louisiana Bayou country, had learned to navigate Blackwater before she learned to drive. This was her mission. She knew it in her bones. The problem, Haggerty continued, is the timeline. Insertion window opens at sunset. Target appears at dawn. That means the operator would need to remain in the water for approximately 14 hours, partially submerged, in temperatures that will approach hypothermic levels. Aldretti's eyes flicked to Teddy. Staff Sergeant Vashon has the longest recorded breath hold time in the battalion. 4 minutes, 47 seconds. Haggerty's jaw tightened. With respect, Captain, this mission requires more than breath holding. It requires sustained physical endurance under extreme conditions. The operator will need to maintain weapon readiness while combating cold water immersion, muscle fatigue, and potential enemy contact. He paused, still not looking at Teddy. I recommend Sergeant Brennan. Brennan is a fine operator, Aldretti said, but his marksmanship scores are not in the same category as Vashon's, and he has no experience with water infiltration. Haggerty finally turned, his eyes meeting Teddy's for the first time. The hardness that was familiar. She had seen it in instructors, in fellow soldiers, in every man who looked at her and saw a problem rather than a peer. Staff Sergeant, he said, do you honestly believe you can spend 14 hours in a canal and still make a precision shot at over 800 meters? Teddy kept her voice level. Yes, Chief. The silence stretched. Aldretti broke it. The mission is assigned to Staff Sergeant Vashon. She leaves at 1900. Haggerty gathered his materials without another word, but as he passed Teddy on his way out, he spoke low enough that only she could hear. When you fail, and you will fail, remember that I warned them. The door closed behind him. Teddy spent the next hour in the equipment bay, preparing her M110 for conditions it was never designed to endure. Waterproofing was an art form she had perfected over years, a ritual of sealants and covers and careful wrapping that transformed her rifle into something that could survive submersion and still fire true. Corporal Yusuf Odemba found her there, his young face creased with the particular anxiety of an intel analyst who had found something important. Staff Sergeant, he said, I have updated imagery of the target site. Teddy set down her rifle. Show me. Odemba spread the photographs across the workbench, pointing to details with careful precision. The canal depth varies here, he said. 3 feet at the entry point, nearly 6 feet beneath the bridge. And there's an alcove in the eastern wall, probably from erosion. You could use it for concealment. She studied the images, memorizing every shadow and angle. Good work, Corporal. This helps. He hesitated, clearly wanting to say something more. What is it? Odemba looked at his boots. I heard what Chief Haggerty said. about the mission being too difficult for her. He trailed off. For a woman? He nodded miserably. Teddy felt the familiar weight of it, the extra burden she carried on every mission, in every room. But she had learned long ago that the weight only slowed you down if you let it. She placed a hand on Odemba's shoulder. Let me tell you something my father taught me before he died. He said the water does not care if you are a man or a woman. It only cares if you can hold your breath long enough to reach the surface. She picked up her rifle again. The mission does not care either. It only cares if I can make the shot. That night, with her gear staged and her route memorized, Teddy walked to the small pool behind the recreation building. The water was tepid, nothing like the cold that awaited her, but it would serve for practice. She lowered herself in, let the water close over her head, and began to count heartbeats in the darkness. Sergeant First Class Dale Kinnick found her there 20 minutes later. He was her spotter, had been since sniper school, and he was one of the few people at Copperhead who had never treated her service as a curiosity or a controversy. Intel, just updated, he said as she surfaced. The target window shifted. Castor has changed his prayer schedule. Teddy wiped water from her eyes. How much time do I have? Kinnick crouched at the pool's edge, his face grim. You will need to enter the water at sunset and hold position until dawn. That is 14 hours in the canal, Teddy. 14 hours in water that will be cold enough to kill you. She looked at the dark surface of the pool, at the reflection of lights rippling across it like scattered stars. Then I had better be ready, she said. Teddy did not sleep that night. She lay on her cot in the female quarters, a converted shipping container that held 4 bunks and smelled permanently of dust and canvas, and she stared at the ceiling while her mind walked the canal route again and again. 14 hours. She had done long operations before. She had spent 36 hours in a hide site outside Mosul, motionless, waiting for a target who never appeared. But that had been dry land, hard ground beneath her belly. This was different. Water sapped heat from the body 25 times faster than air. The mathematics of survival became brutal in water. She closed her eyes and saw her father. Raymond Vashon had been a shrimper in Terrebonne Parish, a quiet man with hands like weathered rope and a laugh that came from somewhere deep in his chest. He had taught Teddy to swim before she could walk, had taken her diving for crawfish traps in water so dark you could not see your own fingers. Hold your breath, little fish, he would say. The water is not your enemy. It is just another place to live. She had been 14 when the storm came, a squall that appeared from nowhere, turning the bay into a washing machine of whitecaps and spray. The boat had rolled, and her father had gone over, and Teddy had watched him sink into water that had suddenly become a stranger. She had Dove after him. Again and again she had Dove, until her lungs burned and her vision blackened at the edges, until the other shrimpers had pulled her from the water and held her while she screamed. They never found his body. Teddy opened her eyes. The ceiling of the shipping container was the same industrial gray it had always been. She breathed slowly, counting heartbeats, pushing the memory back into its compartment. The water is not your enemy, she whispered to no one. At 0400, she rose and began her final preparations. The M110 lay disassembled on her workbench, each component gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She had cleaned it twice already, but she cleaned it again, her hands moving through the ritual with practiced certainty. The rifle was an extension of her body, and today she would ask it to do something extraordinary. She applied the waterproofing layer by layer. Silicone sealant around the scope mounts. Petroleum jelly on the bolt carrier. A thin prophylactic over the muzzle, secured with a rubber band, the old sniper trick that kept water out but would not affect the bullet's trajectory. The round would punch through the membrane without deviation. Kinnick appeared at 0530, carrying 2 cups of coffee that smelled like burned motor oil. Standard FOB brew. He handed her one without speaking and watched her work. You remember graduation day, he said finally. Sniper school. Teddy did not look up from her rifle. I remember. You were the only woman in the class. Half the instructors wanted you to fail. The other half did not think you would make it past the first week. She fitted the barrel back into the receiver, feeling the precise click of metal seating against metal. And yet here I am. Kinnick sipped his coffee. You know what I remember most about that day? When they called your name for top marksman, Sergeant Major Dietrich looked like he had swallowed a wasp. He had been telling anyone who would listen that you did not belong there. Teddy allowed herself a small smile. He shook my hand afterward, nearly broke my fingers. Kinnick set down his cup. Haggerty is not Dietrich. Dietrich was old school, set in his ways, but he respected skill when he saw it. Haggerty is different. He has something personal against women in combat roles. I have seen the way he operates. He will not just hope you fail, Teddy. He will look for ways to make you fail. She met his eyes. Then I will not give him any. The morning briefing was brief. Captain Aldretti reviewed the mission parameters one final time, confirmed the extraction protocol, and dismissed the team. As Teddy gathered her materials, she noticed Haggerty speaking with the communications sergeant in the corner of the room. 20 minutes later, she discovered what he had done. Staff Sergeant Corporal Odemba said, his face troubled, there has been a change to your comms loadout. The PRC 152 units you requested have been reassigned to another operation. You will be using the older PRC 148S instead. Teddy felt her jaw tighten. The 148s were reliable, but heavier, with shorter battery life and less secure encryption. In 14 hours of water immersion, the difference could matter. Who authorized the change? Odemba hesitated. Chief Warrant Officer Haggerty signed the equipment transfer this morning. She could protest. She could go to Aldretti and report the sabotage. But that was exactly what Haggerty wanted. He wanted her to complain, to appear difficult, to give him ammunition for his argument that women could not handle the pressure of special operations. Instead, she nodded. The 148s will work fine. Pack an extra battery. Odemba looked relieved and troubled at the same time. Staff Sergeant, I want you to know that I think what he is doing is wrong. Teddy placed a hand on his shoulder. What matters is the mission, Corporal. Everything else is noise. She was loading her gear into the transport vehicle when she heard the voices from the other side of the motor pool barrier. Two operators she recognized from 2nd Platoon, speaking in the careless way of men who assumed they were alone. Haggerty says she will panic and abort before midnight. One said, he is running a pool. $20 says she does not even make it to the target site. The other laughed. I give her credit for trying. But 14 hours in the water? Come on. That is not a mission. That is a death sentence. Teddy stood motionless, her hand on the vehicle door, and let the words wash over her like the cold water that awaited. She had heard worse. She had heard variations of these words her entire career, from boot camp to ranger selection to sniper school. The words no longer wounded her. They had become fuel instead, something that burned clean and hot in the furnace of her determination. She finished loading her gear in silence. As she climbed into the vehicle, Master Sergeant Lelandcross appeared at her window. He was the senior NCO on the FOB, a 30-year veteran with a face like cracked leather and eyes that missed nothing. Vashon, he said. Master Sergeant. He studied her for a long moment. Haggerty filed a formal objection to your mission assignment this morning. It is in the system now. Official record. Teddy felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the canal. What does that mean? It means if anything goes wrong out there, anything at all, it will not just end your career. Cross leaned closer, his voice dropping. Every woman trying to do what you are doing, every female soldier who wants a shot at special operations, they're all riding on what happens tonight. Haggerty made sure of that. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than any pack she had ever carried. Cross stepped back from the vehicle. Do not let him win, Staff Sergeant. The engine started. The FOB gates opened. And Teddy Vashon rode toward a canal that would either make her a legend or prove every doubter right. The sun was bleeding red across the horizon when the vehicle stopped at the abandoned pump station 2 kilometers upstream from Aldershot. Teddy stepped out into air that still held the day's heat, knowing it was the last warmth she would feel for 14 hours. Kinnick was already unloading his gear. He would take position on a ridge 800 meters from the village, close enough to provide overwatch and guidance, but too far to help if something went wrong in the canal. That was the nature of this mission. Once she entered the water, she was alone. The pump station was a crumbling Soviet-era structure, all rusted pipes and shattered concrete. It had been abandoned for decades, claimed by weeds and silence. The canal mouth gaped beside it like a wound in the earth, black water moving sluggishly toward the village. Teddy studied the entry point. The intelligence photographs had shown a gentle slope into the water, easy access. Reality was different. The bank had eroded, leaving a 4-foot drop to the surface. She would have to lower herself carefully to avoid splashing. Kinnick appeared at her shoulder. I will be in position in 40 minutes. Radio check at 19:45. She nodded, her eyes still on the water. If I miss the check-in, do not assume the worst. The 148s might have trouble with the moisture. I will give you a 15-minute window before I report. He paused. Teddy, you do not have to do this. Not like this. We could request postponement, wait for better conditions. She turned to look at him. His face was creased with concern, the same expression he had worn the day she nearly drowned during combat diver training. Kinnick had been the one to pull her out that day, had held her while she coughed up water and pretended the tears on her face were from the chlorine. If I ask for postponement, she said, Haggerty wins. Every operator on that FOB will say the woman could not handle the pressure. And the next woman who tries to do what I am doing will have that hanging over her head before she even starts. Kinnick was quiet for a moment. Then he extended his hand. I will see you at dawn, Staff Sergeant. She gripped his palm firmly. Dawn. He disappeared into the gathering darkness, moving toward the ridge with the silent efficiency of a man who had spent 20 years learning to be invisible. Teddy watched him go, then turned back to the canal. The water smelled of algae and ancient stone, a scent that transported her instantly to the Louisiana bayous of her childhood. For a moment she was 12 years old again, balanced on the bow of her father's boat, watching the black water slide past like oil. She pushed the memory aside and began her final equipment check. Rifle secure in its waterproof sleeve, sidearms sealed against her thigh, communications gear wrapped in 3 layers of protective membrane. Knife on her belt. Nothing else. Every ounce mattered when you were fighting the water. At 1900 exactly, Teddy lowered herself over the bank and into the canal. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Despite the day's heat, the water was spring-fed from somewhere deep underground, and it wrapped around her leg with icy fingers that immediately began searching for her core warmth. She gasped involuntarily, then controlled her breathing with the discipline of years of training. The water reached her waist, then her chest, then her shoulders. She began to move. Progress was agonizingly slow. The canal floor was uneven, littered with debris that her boots found with every step. She held the rifle above the surface, arms already burning from the awkward angle, and navigated by the fading light that filtered through the water's surface. The first 500 meters passed in a blur of cold and concentration. The canal walls rose on either side, ancient stones fitted together by hands that had turned to dust centuries ago. Ottoman engineers had built this waterway, had diverted rivers, and reshaped the land to feed their empire. Now it served a different purpose. Kinnick's voice crackled in her earpiece at 1945. Overwatch in position. I have eyes on the checkpoint. 12 tangos visible. Target not yet present. Teddy pressed the transmit button, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. Copy. Proceeding to waypoint Alpha. The darkness was nearly complete now. She moved by feel and memory, her mental map of the canal guiding her through water she could no longer see. Each step was a calculated risk, each breath a conscious decision. At the 1-kilometer mark, the canal narrowed. The photographs had shown this section, but they had not captured how tight it truly was. The walls pressed in on either side, reducing the waterway to barely 3 feet across. And the depth had increased. The water lapped at her chin, forcing her to tilt her head back to breathe. She could not hold the rifle above the surface here. The walls were too close, the angle impossible. Teddy made the calculation in an instant. She sealed the waterproof sleeve tighter, took 3 deep breaths, and submerged. The darkness underwater was absolute. She moved by touch, one hand trailing along the canal wall, the other clutching her rifle to her chest. Her lungs began to ache almost immediately, not from lack of air, but from the cold that seemed to squeeze her chest like a vice. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Her hand found open space. The wall fell away. She was through the narrow section. She surfaced as quietly as she could manage, drawing air in controlled sips rather than the desperate gasps her body demanded. The canal had widened again, and she could see stars overhead, impossibly bright against the Iraqi sky. Kinnick's voice again. Lost you on thermals for 40 seconds. Status? She waited until her breathing steadied. Narrow section required full submersion. I am through. Proceeding. Copy. Be advised. I am seeing movement on the canal path ahead. Possible patrol. Teddy froze. How far? 300 meters. 2 tangos. They appear to be walking the perimeter. She pressed herself against the canal wall, feeling the cold stone through her uniform. 300 meters. At her current pace, she would reach them in 15 minutes. If they were walking toward her, the timeline collapsed to less than 5. The mission parameters had not included enemy patrols on the canal path. Intelligence had assessed the route as low risk, unmonitored. But intelligence was not always right. She had 2 choices. Wait for the patrol to pass and risk falling behind schedule, or continue moving and hope the darkness concealed her. The water made the decision for her. She could already feel the cold settling deeper in her muscles, the first whispers of numbness in her fingers and toes. Every minute she stayed still was a minute closer to hypothermia. Movement meant survival. She began to advance again, slower now, each step placed with excruciating care to avoid any sound that might carry across the water. The patrol voices reached her at 200 meters. Arabic, casual, the tone of men who were bored rather than alert. She caught fragments. Complaints about the cold. Something about a card game. At 100 meters, she could see them. 2 figures on the path above, silhouetted against the star field. Rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders. Teddy sank lower into the water until only her eyes and nose remained above the surface. Her rifle was beneath now, pressed against her chest, useless until she could raise it. If they looked down, if they had flashlights, if anything at all went wrong, the mission ended here. The figures stopped directly above her position. One of them lit a cigarette. The flame illuminated his face for a brief moment. Young features twisted into an expression of discontent. He said something to his companion, gestured toward the village, then turned and looked directly down at the canal. Teddy did not breathe, did not blink, did not exist. The cigarette's ember glowed in the darkness like a malevolent eye. Then the man turned away, and the 2 figures continued down the path, their voices fading into the night. She waited a full 60 seconds before she allowed herself to breathe again. Teddy forced herself to move again, her limbs protesting with every stroke. The patrol had passed, but the encounter had cost her something she could not afford to lose. Time. Heat. The illusion of safety. The canal stretched ahead, darker now than it had been before, as if the water itself had absorbed her fear and turned it into shadow. She focused on the mechanics of movement. Left foot forward, right foot forward, arms above the water. Rifle dry. Breathe. Kinnick's voice cut through the silence. Patrol is moving away from your position. You are clear for the next 400 meters. Copy, she whispered. The stone bridge appeared out of the darkness like a ghost. It was older than the canal itself, a remnant of some forgotten empire that had ruled this land before the Ottomans, before the British, before the Americans. The stones were massive, fitted together without mortar, and beneath them the water pooled into a deeper section where the current had carved out an alcove in the eastern wall. Her hide position. Teddy approached slowly, feeling along the wall for the erosion pocket that Odimba had identified in the satellite imagery. Her fingers found the gap, a hollow in the stone just large enough for a human body. She maneuvered herself inside. pressing her back against the rough surface, and felt the canal bottom drop away beneath her feet. The water was deeper here. It reached her neck when she stood flat, forcing her to tilt her chin upward to keep her mouth above the surface. The alcove provided concealment from above, but nothing else. No warmth, no comfort, no escape. She checked her watch. 21:30. She had been in the water for 2.5 hours. 11.5 remained until dawn. Kinnick, she transmitted, I am in position. Beginning observation. Copy. I have limited visual on your location due to the bridge overhang. You will need to be my eyes for the immediate area. Checkpoint status unchanged. 12 tangos. No sign of primary target. Understood. She settled into the alcove and began the long wait. The first hour passed in fragments of sensation. The cold worked its way deeper, moving from her extremities toward her core with patient malevolence. Her fingers grew clumsy, then numb, then painful as the blood retreated from her skin. She flexed them constantly, a rhythm of movement designed to maintain circulation, but each flex required more effort than the last. The second hour brought the cramps. They started in her calves, twin knots of agony that seized her muscles without warning and refused to release. She gritted her teeth against the pain, knowing that any sound could carry across the water to hostile ears. The cramps spread to her thighs, her lower back, her shoulders. Her body was consuming itself, burning fuel it did not have to generate heat it could not keep. At midnight, Kinnick reported activity at the checkpoint. Vehicle arriving. Standby. Teddy watched through the bridge's stone arch, her scope raised just above the waterline. The checkpoint was illuminated by generator-powered floodlights, casting harsh shadows across the road and the armed men who controlled it. A truck had stopped at the barrier, and she could see figures moving around it, searching, questioning. Not the target, just another vehicle in an endless stream of vehicles that passed through Aurashad every night. She lowered her scope and resumed her vigil. The hours crawled past like wounded animals. 1 o'clock. 2. 3. Her mind began to drift, seeking escape from the cold that had become her entire existence. She thought about heat, sunlight on Louisiana Blackwater, her mother's kitchen in August, the stove, radiating warmth that soaked into your bones, the burn of whiskey sliding down her throat on a winter night. She caught herself slipping and snapped back to alertness. Hypothermia played tricks on the mind. It made you drowsy, comfortable, willing to surrender. She had seen it claim men twice her size, had watched them slip into a sleep from which they never woke. Not tonight. Not her. She began reciting rifle specifications in her head, forcing her brain to engage with something concrete. M110 semi-automatic sniper system. Caliber 7.62 by 51 mm NATO. Effective range 800 meters with standard ammunition. Weight 6.94 kilograms with bipod and suppressor. The mental exercise helped, but it could not stop the cold's advance. At 0400, Kinnick's voice carried a new tension. Teddy, we have a problem. I'm seeing a boat on the canal, half a kilometer upstream, and moving toward your position. She felt her heart rate spike, the first surge of adrenaline in hours. What type of vessel? Small fishing boat. 2 occupants. They appear to be checking nets or traps along the banks. The canal was narrow here, barely wide enough for a small boat to pass. If the fishermen came through, they would pass directly over her position. There was nowhere to go. The alcove was her only concealment, and it offered no protection from someone looking straight down into the water. ETA to my position? At current speed, approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes. She could abandon the hide site, move downstream, try to find another position. But that would mean starting over, spending more hours in the water, pushing her body past limits it had already exceeded. And there was no guarantee of finding adequate concealment elsewhere. Or she could stay. Trust the darkness. Trust her training. The boat's engine grew louder, a putt-putt rhythm that echoed off the canal walls like a mechanical heartbeat. Teddy pressed herself deeper into the alcove, feeling the stones scrape against her back, and made her decision. She took 3 deep breaths, hyperventilating slightly to load her blood with oxygen. Then she sank beneath the surface. The world disappeared. Sound became muffled, distant, unreal. She opened her eyes, but saw nothing. Only the absolute blackness of water that had never known light. Her hands found the canal wall and held on, anchoring her against the slight current that tried to pull her toward the open channel. Above her, separated by less than 2 feet of water, the boat passed. She felt it more than heard it. The pressure wave of displaced water. The shadow that somehow made the darkness darker. The vibration of the engine transmitted through the liquid medium that surrounded her. Her lungs began to burn. She counted heartbeats. 60, 70, 80. The boat was directly overhead now. She could sense it there, feel the presence of the hull inches from her face. If she surfaced now, she would come up directly beneath it. The fishermen would see her. The mission would end. 90 heartbeats. 100. The pressure in her chest became a living thing, a creature of fire and desperation clawing at her throat. Her father's face appeared in the darkness, not as she remembered him in life, but as she had imagined him in death, sinking into black water with his eyes still open. Hold your breath, little fish. The water is not your enemy. 120 heartbeats. The boat passed. She felt it move away, the pressure wave diminishing, the engine sound fading into something that might have been silence or might have been the roaring of blood in her ears. Teddy surfaced. The gas that escaped her lips was louder than she intended, a desperate inhalation that seemed to echo off every stone in the canal. She froze, waiting for shouts, for flashlight beams, for gunfire. Nothing. Only the diminishing sound of the boat continuing downstream and Kinnick's voice, tight with controlled fear. I lost you on thermals for 2 minutes. Teddy, talk to me. She waited until she could speak without gasping. Still here. Boat passed directly overhead. Had to go under. A pause. Then, your heart rate just transmitted at 160. You need to stabilize. Working on it. She pressed her back against the alcove wall and focused on her breathing. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Out for 4 counts. The pattern was familiar, drilled into her through years of training, and slowly her heart began to obey. The fishermen had not seen her. The mission continued, but dawn was still 3 hours away, and she could no longer feel her hands. The numbness spread like poison through her veins. Teddy raised her right hand above the waterline and stared at fingers that no longer seemed to belong to her. They were pale, bloodless, curved into a loose claw that refused to straighten on command. She tried to make a fist and watched her hand respond with a delay that terrified her. This was the hand that would pull the trigger. This was the hand that would determine whether 14 hours of suffering meant anything at all. She plunged both hands beneath her armpits, pressing them against the core warmth that still remained in her torso. The cold had taken her extremities, but her heart continued to pump, her lungs continued to breathe, and somewhere deep inside her body there was still heat worth fighting for. The pain came first, a tingling that built into needles, then knives, then something beyond description as blood forced its way back into collapsed capillaries. She welcomed it. Pain meant sensation. Sensation meant control. Kinnick's voice broke through her concentration. Status check. You have been quiet for 20 minutes. Still here, she transmitted. Working on circulation. Understood. Be advised, I am monitoring CommandNet. Haggerty is requesting updates every 30 minutes. He asked Captain Aldretti to authorize abort protocols twice in the last hour. Of course he had. Teddy could picture him perfectly, sitting in the operations center with his coffee and his certainty, waiting for the call that would prove him right. She wondered if he was running another betting pool. Probably. What was Aldretti's response? Negative on abort. She told him to let you work. Something that might have been gratitude flickered through Teddy's chest, a brief warmth that had nothing to do with body temperature. Aldretti barely knew her. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times in 6 months. But the captain had looked at her record, at her scores, at 15 years of service that spoke louder than any prejudice, and she had chosen to believe. Teddy would not let that belief be wasted. She continued working her hands, flexing and releasing, forcing blood into tissue that had begun to die. The process was agonizing and slow, but gradually the numbness retreated. She could feel her palms again, her thumbs, the webbing between her fingers. Her trigger finger remained stubbornly dead. She focused on it specifically, massaging the digit with her other hand, bending and straightening the joint with mechanical repetition. The finger was the mission. Everything else was secondary. At 0445, sensation returned. A distant tingle at first, then a throbbing ache, then the exquisite agony of living tissue reclaiming itself. She pressed her finger against the alcove wall and felt the texture of stone. She could shoot. The relief lasted exactly 30 seconds. "Teddy," Kinnick said, his voice carrying an edge she had not heard before. Intel update from Odemba. The target, Kasser, is responsible for more than the IED cell. They found additional information in capture documents. She waited, sensing that whatever came next would change something fundamental about this mission. 3 weeks ago, a convoy was ambushed north of Mosul. Roadside bomb followed by small arms fire. For casualties, one of them was a Marine, Lance Corporal Diana Reyes. She was 22 years old. Teddy closed her eyes. She had not known Lance Corporal Reyes, had never heard her name before this moment. But she knew her anyway, knew the journey she had taken, the obstacles she had overcome, the doors she had pushed open simply by existing in a world that did not want her. 22. Younger than Teddy had been when she earned her sniper qualification. Younger than she had been when she first understood that her gender would always be a factor in how others perceived her service. The documents confirmed Kasser planned and executed that ambush personally. Kinnick continued. He has been targeting convoys specifically because of their mixed-gender crews. He believes killing female soldiers undermines American morale. The cold that had been her enemy for 11 hours suddenly felt like something else. It felt like focus, like clarity, like the kind of anger that did not burn hot, but froze everything it touched into diamond-hard purpose. "Copy," she said. Her voice did not waver. "Teddy, I know what you are feeling right now. Do not let it affect the shot. Emotion is the enemy of precision." She almost laughed. Kinnick had trained her better than that. The anger was not in her hands, or her eyes, or her breathing. It was somewhere deeper, somewhere that would not interfere with the mechanics of what she had to do. If anything, it had burned away the last of her doubt. Diana Reyes had died because a man believed that killing women would break American resolve. In a few hours, Teddy would show him exactly how wrong he was. The sky began to change. It was subtle at first, a lightening at the eastern edge of the horizon that could have been imagination. But Teddy had spent too many nights watching for dawn to mistake its arrival. The stars faded by degrees, their light overwhelmed by something older and more powerful. Kinnick confirmed what she already knew. First light in approximately 40 minutes. Target typically appears for morning prayer between 06:15 and 06:30. She began her final preparations. The rifle came out of its waterproof sleeve with practiced efficiency, each movement careful and deliberate despite her still clumsy fingers. She checked the scope for moisture, found none, and felt a surge of gratitude for the hour she had spent perfecting her waterproofing technique. The prophylactic membrane still covered the muzzle, intact and dry. She left it in place. The bullet would punch through without deviation. She settled into her firing position, wedging herself into the alcove at an angle that allowed her to rest the rifle's forestock against a jutting stone. The bridge provided cover from above, and the growing light would be behind her, silhouetting the checkpoint while leaving her position in shadow. It was a good position. Not perfect, but good. Range to target, she requested. 847 meters. Wind is calm at the moment, but I'm seeing some movement in the trees near the checkpoint. Expect variable gusts from the east as the sun rises. Copy. I will need continuous wind calls. You will have them. Teddy pressed her eye to the scope and found the checkpoint. The floodlights were still on, but they would be extinguished soon as the natural light made them unnecessary. She could see the guards clearly now, Young men with rifles who had no idea that death was watching them from beneath a bridge half a mile away. She was not here for them. She was here for Kasser, for Diana Reyes, for every woman who had ever been told she did not belong in combat and had gone anyway. The sky continued to brighten. The minutes continued to pass. And somewhere in that checkpoint, a man who had built his reputation on killing women was preparing to pray. The checkpoint floodlights died at 0552, plunging the compound into the gray half-light of pre-dawn. Teddy watched through her scope as the guards adjusted to the change, their movements sluggish with the exhaustion of men who had been awake all night. They would be at their least alert now, in this liminal space between darkness and day. She counted 12 figures, the same 12 Kinnick had reported throughout the night. Kasser was not among them. Any sign of the target, she transmitted. Negative, but there is activity in the main building. Lights coming on. He may be preparing for prayer. She adjusted her position slightly, feeling the cold stone shift against her back. Her body had passed through pain hours ago and emerged into something else, a distant numbness that allowed her to function even as it warned her of damage being done. She would pay for this night in the days to come. Muscle recovery, joint inflammation, possibly worse. But that was a problem for the woman who survived. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the scope and the target and the 847 meters between them. The eastern sky caught fire. Orange and gold and crimson spread across the horizon like a wound opening, and the first true rays of sunlight speared through the gap between earth and cloud. The checkpoint transformed in that light, its ugly concrete barriers and sandbag walls suddenly painted in colors that seemed almost beautiful. Teddy felt the warmth on her face and nearly wept. She had not realized how close she was to breaking until that moment. 14 hours in water that had tried to kill her, and now the sun touched her skin and she understood that she might actually survive this. The realization hit her with physical force, a shudder that ran through her entire body and threatened to shake the rifle in her hands. She breathed through it. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The shudder passed. The rifle steadied. The mission continued. Kinnick's voice cut through her focus. Movement at the main building. Door opening. She shifted her scope to the entrance of the largest structure in the checkpoint compound. A figure emerged, older than the guards, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who knew his own importance. He wore civilian clothes rather than military fatigues, and his beard was streaked with gray. Ahmad Gassar, the man who had killed Diana Reyes, the man who believed that murdering women would break American will. Teddy placed her crosshairs on his chest and felt nothing but cold certainty. Target confirmed. She transmitted. I have a shot. Wait, Kinnick said. He is moving toward the prayer area, but he has guards flanking him. If you fire now, you will be shooting through a narrow window between their positions. Wind call, 2 minutes right to left, approximately 4 miles per hour. She calculated the adjustment, dialing her scope with fingers that responded slowly but accurately. The wind would push the bullet left. She compensated right. At 847 meters, even a formal upper breeze could shift the point of impact by inches. Kasser reached the prayer area, a small concrete pad oriented toward Mecca. He spread a rug on the ground with ritual precision, then stood facing east, his lips moving in the first words of the far prayer. The guards took positions on either side of him, close enough to provide protection, far enough to give him space for worship. The gap between them was perhaps 18 inches. Teddy exhaled slowly and placed her finger on the trigger. Hold, Kinnick said suddenly. Wind is shifting. I'm seeing gusts from the northeast now, variable speed. Do not take the shot until I give you a stable reading. She froze, her finger resting against the trigger without pressure. Through the scope, she watched Kasser begin the physical movements of prayer. Standing, bowing, prostrating. Each position held him in place for seconds that felt like hours. The sun continued to rise. The shadows shortened. And with every passing moment, the light crept closer to her position beneath the bridge. Kinnick, she transmitted, I am losing concealment. The sun angle is going to expose me within the next few minutes. I know. Wind is still variable. You need to wait. She felt the first direct ray of sunlight touch the water beside her hiding spot. The canal surface began to sparkle, throwing reflections against the bridge stones. Soon those reflections would illuminate her position. Soon anyone looking at the canal would see a shape that did not belong. "Wind call," she demanded. Kinnick's response carried the strain of a man doing impossible calculations in real time. Gusting between 3 and 6 miles per hour. Direction still variable. "Teddy, this is not a clean shot." Through the scope, she watched Casser rise from prostration and return to standing. He would complete the prayer cycle in minutes. Then he would return to the main building, surrounded by guards, invisible behind concrete walls. The window was closing. She thought about Diana Reyes, 22 years old, a Marine who had earned her place in a combat zone through the same struggle that Teddy knew intimately. Dead because a man like Casser believed that killing women sent a message. She thought about Haggerty, waiting at FOB Copperhead for news of her failure. About the formal objection sitting in the system, ready to be used as evidence that women did not belong in special operations. About every door that would close if she came back empty-handed. She thought about 14 hours in water that had tried to kill her, and a shot that would make all of it mean something. "Kinnick," she said, her voice steady. "Give me your best estimate." A pause. Then, "Wind appears to be settling. Call it 4 miles per hour from the east, but I cannot guarantee it will hold." It was not clean. It was not certain, but it was the only window she was going to get. Captain Aldretti's voice crackled over the command net, startling her. She had not realized the channel was open. "Vashon, this is Copperhead Actual. What is your status?" Teddy hesitated for a fraction of a second. In the background, she could hear Haggerty's voice demanding that the mission be aborted, insisting that the conditions were unacceptable, that she was going to miss and compromise the entire operation. Aldretti cut him off. "Staff Sergeant Vashon, you have command authority on this shot. It is your call." The weight of that trust settled onto her shoulders alongside everything else she carried. Aldretti was not just giving her permission. She was giving her ownership. Whatever happened next, the responsibility belonged to Teddy alone. She pressed her eye to the scope, found Castor in the crosshairs, watched him rise from another prostration, his face turned toward the east and the sun that had risen to meet him. "Wind hold," Kinnick said quietly. "For miles per hour. Steady." Her finger tightened on the trigger. 1 pound of pressure. 2 pounds. The mechanism was ready. The bullet was ready. She was ready. Castor completed his prayer cycle and turned slightly, his body angling toward the main building. The gap between the guards narrowed. "Teddy," Kinnick said, "the window is closing." She knew. She could see it happening in real time. The geometry of bodies and angles collapsing toward impossibility. In 3 seconds, maybe 4, the shot would no longer exist. She stopped breathing, found the space between heartbeats where her body was perfectly still. And in that frozen moment, Ahmad Castor turned his head and looked directly at the canal. He could not see her. She knew he could not see her. But in that instant, their eyes seemed to meet across 847 meters of a rocky morning, and she felt something pass between them. Recognition, perhaps, or fate. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle spoke. The bullet traveled for 1.3 seconds. In that eternity between trigger pull and impact, Teddy watched through her scope as the round crossed 847 meters of Iraqi air. She saw the guards standing motionless, unaware that death was already among them. She saw Castor's face, still turned toward the canal, his expression curious rather than afraid. Then the bullet arrived. It passed through the gap between the guards with inches to spare on either side. It punched through the thin membrane, covering her muzzle without deviation. It found Ahmad Castor exactly where she had aimed, center mass, and it ended him before he could understand what had happened. He dropped. For a moment, nothing moved. The guards stood frozen, their minds unable to process the sight of their leader crumpling to the prayer rug. The morning birds continued to sing. The sun continued to rise. The world continued to turn as if nothing significant had occurred. Then the checkpoint erupted. Shouts filled the air. Arabic curses and commands overlapping in a chaos of panic and rage. The guards scattered, some dropping behind cover, others spinning in circles with their weapons raised, searching for a threat they could not locate. The suppressor had muffled the rifle's report, and at 847 meters, the sound had dispersed into something that could have been anything or nothing. They did not know where the shot had come from. They did not know she existed. Target down. Kinnick's voice confirmed in her ear. I say again, target is down. Teddy, that was the most incredible shot I have ever witnessed. She did not respond. There was no time for celebration, no space for relief. The mission was not complete until she was back inside friendly lines. And right now, she was half a mile from a checkpoint full of armed men who would be searching for the shooter within minutes. She slid the rifle back into its waterproof sleeve with hands that trembled from exhaustion rather than fear. The movement felt impossibly slow, her muscles responding to commands with a delay that frightened her. 14 hours in cold water had taken a toll that adrenaline could only partially mask. Moving to extraction point, she transmitted. "What's my route?" Kinnick's response was immediate. "Head downstream 400 meters. There's a bend in the canal that will put you out of line of sight from the checkpoint. Extraction team is standing by at grid reference Tango 7. Copy." She pushed off from the alcove that had been her home for 11 hours and began to move. The water resisted her, dragging at limbs that had forgotten how to function properly. Each step required conscious effort, a deliberate command from brain to leg that should have been automatic. Behind her, the chaos at the checkpoint continued. She could hear engines starting, voices shouting coordinates, the beginning of a search pattern that would expand outward from the village like ripples from a stone. They would check the roads first, then the fields, then the surrounding structures. The canal would come later, if at all. She just had to be gone before later arrived. The first 100 meters passed in a blur of cold and determination. The canal walls rose on either side, ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of violence and would witness centuries more. She kept her head low, her profile minimal, moving through water that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. At 200 meters, her right leg cramped. The pain was immediate and absolute, a seizure of muscle that locked her knee at an awkward angle and nearly sent her face first into the water. She caught herself against the canal wall, biting back a cry that would have echoed across the morning stillness. Kinnick's voice cut through the agony. "Teddy, your movement has stopped." "Status. Cramp," she managed. "Give me a minute." "You do not have a minute. I am seeing vehicles mobilizing at the checkpoint. They're going to start searching the perimeter." She knew. She could hear the engines herself now, the growl of trucks being loaded with armed men. The search was beginning, and she was 200 meters from safety with a leg that refused to work. Teddy thought about her father, about the day he had taught her to swim through pain, to keep moving when her body demanded she stop. The bayou does not care if you're tired, little fish. It only cares if you keep swimming. She forced her leg to straighten, feeling the muscle scream in protest. Then she pushed off the wall and continued downstream. The next 200 meters were the longest of her life. Each step sent jolts of pain through her cramped leg. Each breath felt like it might be her last. The water seemed to grow colder, heavier, more determined to drag her down. But she kept moving. At 350 meters, Kinnick spoke again. "I have visual on a patrol heading toward the canal. 200 meters north of your position and closing. You need to increase speed." She tried. Her body refused. The best she could manage was a lurching half-run that splashed more than she would have liked, that announced her presence to anyone with ears to hear. 100 meters to the extraction point. She could see the bend in the canal ahead, the curve that would shield her from hostile eyes. Safety was so close she could almost taste it. 50 meters. The patrol reached the canal bank behind her. She heard them before she saw them, boots crunching on gravel, voices raised in urgent Arabic. They had not spotted her yet, but they were looking. Flashlight beams cut through the morning dimness, sweeping across the water in search patterns that would find her in seconds. Teddy made a decision. She took a breath and submerged completely, letting the black water close over her head for the final time. Her hands found the canal bottom, fingers digging into mud and stone, and she pulled herself forward in a desperate underwater crawl. Her lungs burned. Her vision darkened at the edges. Her father's face appeared in the blackness, smiling the way he had smiled on summer mornings when the catch was good and the world was kind. She broke the surface around the bend, gasping, invisible to the patrol that continued searching the straight section of canal behind her. The extraction point was 20 meters ahead. She could see the concrete drainage pipe that marked the location, could see the tire tracks in the mud where the vehicle should have been waiting. But there was no vehicle. Kinnick's voice carried something she had never heard from him before. Controlled panic. "Teddy, we have a problem." The extraction team hit an IED on the approach road. "They are not coming. You need to get out on foot." She stared at the empty extraction point, at the mud and the concrete and the absence of salvation. 2 kilometers of hostile territory stood between her and friendly lines. 2 kilometers with a body that could barely stand, in daylight that would expose her every step of the way. For the first time in 14 hours, Teddy Vashon allowed herself to feel afraid. Teddy pulled herself out of the canal and collapsed on the muddy bank. For 10 seconds she lay there, face pressed against earth that felt warm compared to the water she had just escaped, her body shaking with tremors she could not control. Then she forced herself to move. The drainage pipe offered temporary concealment, a concrete tube barely wide enough for her to crouch inside. She wedged herself into the shadows and assessed her situation with the clinical detachment of a soldier who had no other choice. Her rifle was still functional, sealed inside its waterproof sleeve. Her sidearm remained secure to her thigh. Her communications gear had survived, though the battery indicator showed less than 30% remaining. She had no food, no dry clothing, and no extraction. 2 kilometers to friendly lines. In her current condition, moving at maximum sustainable speed that translated to approximately 40 minutes of exposure in hostile territory. She would not last 40 minutes. "Kinnick," she transmitted, "I need options." His response came immediately, and she could hear him working the problem in real time. "QRF is spinning up at Copperhead, but they are 20 minutes out minimum. Local assets are not available. The IED that hit the extraction team has the road blocked." "What about air support?" "Negative. No available platforms in range for immediate tasking. You are on your own for at least 15 minutes. 15 minutes. An eternity when every second brought the search patrols closer to her position. She heard vehicles in the distance, the growl of engines and the crunch of tires on gravel. The checkpoint forces were expanding their perimeter, methodically covering ground in a pattern that would eventually bring them to the canal's edge. When they found the extraction point, they would know someone had been here. The mud held her boot prints like accusations. Teddy made a decision. Waiting meant death. Movement meant risk, but risk was better than certainty. She crawled out of the drainage pipe and began to move. The terrain between the canal and friendly lines was a patchwork of orchards and farm fields, broken by occasional structures and irrigation ditches. It offered concealment, but not cover, places to hide, but nothing that would stop a bullet. She moved from shadow to shadow, using every fold in the ground, every tree, trunk, and wall fragment. Her legs screamed with every step. The cramp had subsided, but left behind damage that would take days to heal. She compensated by shifting her weight to her left side, developing a lurching gait that was ugly but functional. 300 meters from the canal, she heard the first shout. Arabic, urgent, coming from somewhere to her north. They had found her trail. She dropped behind a low mud wall and pressed herself flat against the earth. Through a gap in the crumbling bricks, she could see 2 figures moving along the canal bank, following the boot prints she had left in the mud. They were young, armed with AK-47s, and they moved with the confidence of men who believed they were hunting rather than being hunted. Teddy raised her rifle. The waterproof sleeve came off in one smooth motion, and she settled the M110 against her shoulder with the familiarity of long practice. The 2 men were perhaps 200 meters away, well within effective range, easy targets against the morning sky. She placed her crosshairs on the lead man's chest and felt her finger find the trigger. Then she hesitated. The shot would be clean. The kill would be justified. But the sound would bring every patrol in the area converging on her position. She would trade 2 dead enemies for a dozen live ones who knew exactly where she was. She lowered the rifle and let them pass. The decision cost her. The men followed her trail to the drainage pipe, found where she had rested, and began radioing coordinates to their companions. Within minutes, the search would concentrate on this area. Her window was closing. Kinnick's voice carried new urgency. Teddy, I am tracking multiple contacts converging on your position. You have maybe 5 minutes before they box you in. I know. QRF is still 12 minutes out. Then I need to buy 12 minutes. She moved again, faster now, abandoning stealth for speed. The orchard swallowed her, rows of date palms that provided vertical cover but left her exposed between the trunks. She ran in a crouch, her damaged leg threatening to buckle with every stride. Behind her, she could hear the search tightening. Engines, voices, the occasional crack of a weapon being fired at shadows. They were scared and angry and dangerous, and they were getting closer. At the edge of the orchard, she found a structure, an old pump house, abandoned like so many buildings in this war-scarred land, its walls pocked with bullet holes from some forgotten engagement. It was not much, but it was something. She ducked inside and took stock. The building had 1 door and 2 windows, all facing different directions. Good sight lines, limited entry points. If she had to make a stand, this was as good a place as any. But making a stand meant dying. 1 rifle against a dozen or more fighters was not a battle. It was a last resort. Kinnick, she transmitted, I am in a structure approximately 800 meters from the canal. Pump house, single story, stone construction. I can hold here, but I need that QRF. Copy. Relaying your position now. QRF is 10 minutes out. 10 minutes. She positioned herself at the window, facing the orchard, and watched the tree line for movement. The sun was fully up now, flooding the landscape with golden light that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. She could hear birds singing in the palms, insects buzzing in the dry grass, the distant bleating of goats from some nearby farm. And beneath it all, growing louder with each passing second, the sound of men hunting her. The first patrol emerged from the orchard at a distance of 150 meters. 4 men, spread in a tactical formation, weapons raised. They had not spotted the pump house yet, but they were moving in its direction with the inevitability of water flowing downhill. Teddy settled her rifle against the window frame and placed her crosshairs on the lead man. 8 minutes to QRF. For hostiles visible, unknown numbers behind them. She could take the first 2 before they reached cover. Maybe the third if she was fast. But the fourth would find concealment and pin her down, and then it would just be a matter of time. She needed another option. Her eyes swept the interior of the pump house, searching for anything useful. Old machinery, rusted pipes, a pile of debris in one corner that might once have been furniture. And in the far wall, half hidden behind a collapsed shelf, a door she had not noticed before. She crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled the debris aside. The door was wooden, ancient, hanging from hinges that had nearly rusted through. Beyond it lay darkness and the smell of stagnant water. A well, or a cistern, some kind of underground reservoir connected to the pump system. Another place to hide. Another stretch of cold, dark water. Teddy thought about 14 hours in the canal, about the numbness and the fear and the moment she had nearly drowned beneath the fishing boat, about her father sinking into black water while she screamed. Then she thought about the men outside, getting closer with every heartbeat. She opened the door and descended into the darkness. The cistern swallowed her whole. Stone steps descended into blackness, slick with moisture and age, and Teddy navigated them by feel alone. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the mineral smell of water that had been trapped underground for decades. At the bottom, her boots found liquid, and she waded forward until the water reached her waist. She pulled the door, closed behind her, and stood in absolute darkness, listening. Above, muffled by stone and earth, she heard the patrol enter the pump house. Boots on concrete, voices calling to each other in Arabic, the crash of equipment being overturned as they searched. She did not breathe, did not move, became nothing but a shadow in a place where shadows had no meaning. The voices grew louder, then softer, then louder again. Someone was standing directly above her, separated by a floor of packed earth and ancient stone. She could hear him breathing, hear the creak of his equipment as he shifted his weight. If he found the door, she would have to kill him, and whoever came after him, and whoever came after that. She would fight until she could not fight anymore, and then she would die in this hole in the ground, and Haggerty would shake his head and say he had warned them all along. The footsteps moved away. She heard the patrol exit the pump house, heard their voices fade as they continued the search elsewhere. They had missed the door. They had missed her. Teddy allowed herself to breathe. Kinnick, she transmitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I am in a cistern beneath the pump house. Hostiles have moved past my position. Copy. Good thinking. QRF is 6 minutes out. Can you hold? I can hold. She settled against the cistern wall and waited in the darkness. The water was cold, but not as cold as the canal, and her body had grown so accustomed to immersion that the sensation barely registered. She was becoming something amphibious, she thought, something that lived between worlds. The minutes crawled past. She counted them in heartbeats, in breaths, in the slow drip of water from somewhere in the darkness above her head. At the 4-minute mark, she heard helicopters. The sound was distant at first, a rhythmic thudding that could have been her own pulse. But it grew louder, more distinct, and she recognized the signature of Black Hawk's inbound. QRF was approaching. The patrol heard it too. She could hear them shouting above, their voices carrying the panic of men who understood that the hunters had become the hunted. Engines started. Vehicles began to move. The search was collapsing as the fighters retreated toward the village. Teddy, Kinnick said, QRF is 2 minutes out. They're taking fire from the checkpoint, but pushing through. I need you to mark your position. She had no flares, no smoke grenades, nothing that could signal her location from underground. But she had her radio, and she had her voice. I am in the cistern. She transmitted on the QRF frequency. Pump house 800 meters south-southeast of the Canal extraction point. I will surface when I hear friendly forces. A new voice responded, clipped and professional. Copy, Vashin. This is Raider 16. We are 90 seconds out. Stay down until we secure the area. She waited. The helicopters grew louder, drowning out every other sound. She felt the vibration through the water, through the stone, through her bones. Then she heard gunfire, the sharp crack of American weapons answering the deeper bark of AK-47s. The QRF was engaging. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes. When it ended, the silence felt almost holy. Raider 16 to Vashin. Area secure. You can come out now. Teddy climbed the stone steps on legs that barely functioned. She pushed open the wooden door and emerged into sunlight, so bright it blinded her. For a moment she stood swaying in the pump house doorway, unable to see, unable to think, unable to do anything but exist. Then hands grabbed her, American hands, steadying her as she stumbled forward. Easy, Staff Sergeant. We got you. She blinked until her vision cleared and found herself looking at Master Sergeant Leland Cross. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, and he held his rifle in one hand while the other gripped her arm. The QRF vehicles were arrayed around the pump house in a defensive perimeter. She could see soldiers taking cover, weapons pointed outward, watching for threats. Beyond them, smoke rose from the direction of the checkpoint. Cross studied her with eyes that missed nothing. The waterlogged uniform, the rifle still clutched in her white-knuckled grip. The 1,000-yard stare that came from pushing a human body past its limits. 14 hours in the water, he said. Then a 2-kilometer exfil on foot with hostiles on your tail. He shook his head slowly. I have been in this army 30 years, Vashin. I have never seen anything like what you just did. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. The adrenaline was fading, and in its absence she could feel everything. The the cold that had seeped into her marrow, the damage to muscles pushed beyond endurance, the weight of 14 hours of fear and determination and survival. Cross seemed to understand. He guided her toward one of the vehicles, his grip gentle but firm. "We have a medic standing by. You're going to be fine." She let herself be led. Let herself be helped into the vehicle. Let herself collapse onto the seat as the convoy began to move. Through the window, she watched the Iraqi countryside slide past. Date palms and farm fields and ancient stone walls, all bathed in morning light. She had spent the night in the water beneath this land, had taken a life and nearly lost her own, and now she was going home. Kinnick's voice crackled in her ear one final time. "Teddy, Haggerty tried to abort your extraction, said you had already failed and the mission was compromised." He paused, and when he spoke again, she could hear something like wonder in his voice. "Captain Aldretti relieved him of duty 20 minutes ago. Your shot was confirmed by satellite imagery. Target eliminated. You did it." Teddy closed her eyes and let the words wash over her. She had done it. The vehicle hit a bump in the road, jarring her damaged leg, and she did not even feel the pain. She was beyond pain now, beyond cold, beyond fear. She was somewhere else entirely, a place where 14 hours in a canal and an 847-meter shot through an 18-inch gap were not impossible things, but simply things she had done. The convoy rolled toward FOB Copperhead, and Staff Sergeant Theodora Vashon allowed herself, for the first time in 15 hours, to rest. The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and canvas, familiar scents that meant safety. Teddy lay on a cot wrapped in thermal blankets, and Fourline feeding warm saline into her arm, and she stared at the ceiling while her body slowly remembered what it meant to be warm. The medic had been thorough. Core temperature check, extremity examination, assessment of the muscle damage in her leg. He had clucked his tongue at the state of her hands, at the pruned and bloodless skin that would take days to fully recover. But he had found nothing that would not heal. "You were lucky," he had said. "Another hour in that water, and we would be having a different conversation." She had not felt lucky. She had felt like a woman who had calculated the odds and bet everything on her ability to beat them. Kinnick arrived an hour after she reached the FOB. He appeared in the tent entrance, his face still carrying the dust of his Overwatch position, and he stood there for a long moment without speaking. Then he crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her cot. 847 meters, he said quietly, through an 18-inch gap, after 14 hours in the water. His voice carried something she had never heard from him before. Reverence, perhaps, or awe. "That is the finest shot I have ever witnessed in 20 years of service. It is the finest shot anyone has ever witnessed." She turned her head to look at him. "I had a good spotter." He almost smiled. "You had a spotter who was certain you were going to die out there. When you went under for 2 minutes beneath that boat, I thought I had lost you. When the extraction failed, I thought I had lost you again." He shook his head. "You just kept coming back." The tent flap opened again, and Captain Aldretti entered. Her uniform was crisp despite the early hour, her bearing as composed as ever, but something in her eyes had changed. She looked at Teddy the way officers looked at soldiers who had exceeded every expectation. "Staff Sergeant Vashon, how are you feeling?" Teddy started to sit up, ingrained military courtesy overriding her exhaustion, but Aldretti waved her back down. "Stay where you are. That is an order." "Yes, ma'am." Aldretti pulled a folding chair from the corner and positioned it at the foot of the cot. She sat with the careful precision of someone who had something important to say. "I have just finished reviewing the satellite imagery and the after-action reports." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "What you accomplished last night is being described as one of the most remarkable sniper operations in the history of special operations. The shot alone would be exceptional. The conditions under which you made it are unprecedented." Teddy did not know what to say, so she said nothing. Aldretti continued, "I am putting you in for a Bronze Star with Valor. The paperwork is already being processed." She allowed herself a small smile. "I suspect it will be approved rather quickly." The words washed over Teddy without fully registering. Medals were abstractions, symbols that pointed at something real but could never capture it. The reality was 14 hours of cold and fear and determination. The reality was Diana Reyes, 22 years old, who would never know that her death had been avenged. "Ma'am," Teddy said the target. "Kasser, the intel about him targeting female soldiers specifically, is that being released?" Aldrich nodded. "It will be included in the official report. The world will know what kind of man he was and what kind of soldier took him down." Something loosened in Teddy's chest, a knot she had not realized she was carrying. It mattered that people would know. It mattered that Diana Reyes would be remembered as more than a casualty statistic. The tent flap opened a third time, and Corporal Odemba burst in with the barely contained energy of a young soldier who had not yet learned to mask his emotions. His face was split by a grin so wide it threatened to crack. "Staff Sergeant," he said, practically bouncing on his heels. "Everyone is talking about it. The whole FOB knows. You spent 14 hours in a canal and made an impossible shot and escaped on foot through hostile territory." He paused to catch his breath. "You're a legend." Teddy felt something unfamiliar tugging at her lips. A smile. She had almost forgotten what those felt like. "I had good intel, Corporal. That canal reconnaissance he provided made the difference." Odemba's grin somehow grew even wider. He looked like he might actually burst from pride. Aldrich rose from her chair. "I will let you rest, Staff Sergeant, but I wanted you to know something else." She met Teddy's eyes directly. "Chief Warrant Officer Haggerty has been removed from his position pending review. His conduct during your mission, including the equipment reassignment and his repeated attempts to abort the operation, has been documented and forwarded to command." Teddy absorbed this information without visible reaction. She had not undertaken the mission to defeat Haggerty. She had undertaken it because it needed to be done and she was the one who could do it. But she would be lying if she said his removal did not bring satisfaction. "What will happen to him?" Aldrich's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "That is above my pay grade. But I can tell you that his formal objection to your mission assignment is now part of the official record, right next to the documentation of your success." She paused. "History will show that he tried to stop you, and history will show that you succeeded anyway." The captain departed, leaving Teddy alone with Kinnick and the lingering warmth of her words. Kinnick leaned back in his chair. "How does it feel?" Teddy considered the question. Her body ached in ways she had not known were possible. Her hand still tingled with returning sensation. Her leg throbbed with every heartbeat. But beneath all of that, something else was growing, something that felt like peace. "It feels like I did my job," she said finally. "It feels like I proved something that should not have needed proving." Kinnick nodded slowly. "It should not have needed proving, but it did. And you proved it in a way that no one can ever deny or dismiss or explain away." He stood, stretching muscles that had spent their own long night on a cold ridge. "Get some rest, Teddy. You have earned it." He left her alone in the tent, surrounded by thermal blankets and the steady drip of the four and the knowledge that somewhere out there, the world was beginning to learn her name. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not dream of drowning. She woke to find Haggerty standing at the foot of her cot. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming, her mind conjuring the face of the man who had tried to end her career. But the tent was real, the afternoon light filtering through the canvas was real, and Chief Warrant Officer Bryce Haggerty was really standing there with an expression she had never seen him wear before. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than he had seemed in the briefing room, when his certainty had filled the space like a physical force. The authority that had radiated from him was gone, stripped away along with his position, and what remained was just a man in a uniform that no longer fit the same way. "Staff Sergeant," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual edge. Teddy pushed herself up on the cot, ignoring the protest from her exhausted muscles. She did not speak. She simply waited, curious despite herself about what had brought him here. Haggerty stood in silence for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. When he finally spoke, the words seemed to cost him something. "I was wrong about you." She had expected many things. Excuses, perhaps. Justifications. the kind of grudging acknowledgement that changed nothing and meant less. But the raw simplicity of his admission caught her off guard. He continued before she could respond. I have spent 15 years believing that women in combat roles would get soldiers killed. I believed it because I needed to believe it, because believing it was easier than accepting that my brother died for no reason at all. Teddy remembered what Kinnick had told her. Haggerty's younger brother, killed in Afghanistan. A female medic who had allegedly frozen during the ambush. I looked up the after-action report, Haggerty said. After they relieved me. I had never actually read it before. I just accepted what I was told, what I wanted to hear. He finally met her eyes, and she saw something there that might have been shame. The medic did not freeze. She was trying to save him. She took 3 rounds in the chest while shielding his body, and she kept working on him until she bled out. The tent felt very quiet. I blamed her for 16 years, Haggerty continued. I used her as proof that women did not belong in combat. And she died trying to save my brother's life. Teddy thought about all the ways she could respond. She could rage at him for the obstacles he had placed in her path, for the careers he had damaged, for the women he had dismissed and undermined. She could accept his confession with cold professionalism and send him away unchanged. She could forgive him and mean it, or forgive him and not mean it, or refuse to forgive him at all. Instead, she said the only thing that felt true. Medics do not freeze. She kept her voice level, almost gentle. They run toward the gunfire while everyone else runs away. Whatever happened to your brother, that woman did not fail him. Haggerty's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might break. But he held himself together through what looked like sheer force of will. I know that now. He straightened slightly, some fragment of military bearing returning. I cannot undo what I did to you, Staff Sergeant. I cannot take back the equipment I reassigned or the objections I filed or the things I said about you to anyone who would listen. But I can tell you that I was wrong. And I can make sure that I never do to another soldier what I did to you. It was not an apology. Not exactly. But it was something close, something that had clearly cost him more than he had expected to pay. Teddy considered him for a long moment. The anger she had carried was still there, banked coals that could easily be fanned into flame. But beneath the anger was something else. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the perspective that came from spending 14 hours contemplating her own death. What happened to you is not her fault, she said finally. And what happened to me was not about your brother. You made choices, Chief. Bad ones. But you're not the first person to let grief turn into something ugly, and you will not be the last. Haggerty nodded slowly, absorbing her words. She continued. I do not forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I understand why you became what you became. And I hope you find a way to become something else. He stood there for another moment, and she could see him wrestling with something. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, which he placed on the table beside her cot. It was a bronze star, worn, slightly tarnished, mounted on a piece of ribbon that had faded with age. That was my brother's, he said. They awarded it to him posthumously. I have carried it for 16 years as a reminder of what I thought I knew about women in combat. Teddy looked at the medal, but did not touch it. I want you to have it, Haggerty said, not as an apology, as an acknowledgement. You earned something last night that I spent 16 years denying was possible. He paused. My brother would have been proud to serve alongside you. Before she could respond, he turned and walked out of the tent, leaving her alone with a dead man's medal and the complicated weight of an enemy's surrender. She picked up the bronze star and held it in her palm. It was lighter than she expected, this small piece of metal that represented so much pain and pride and loss. She thought about Haggerty's brother, about the medic who had died trying to save him, about all the soldiers whose stories were never told. Then she set the medal on the table and lay back on her cot. The anger was still there. It would probably always be there, a scar that marked where Haggerty's prejudice had cut her. But scars healed. They became part of you without defining you. Kinnick appeared in the tent entrance, his eyebrows raised. I just saw Haggerty leaving. He looked like someone had gut-punched him. Teddy smiled faintly. I think someone did. A long time ago. He's just now starting to feel it. Kinnick noticed the bronze star on the table, but did not comment. Instead, he crossed to her cot and sat in the chair that had become his unofficial station. "Formation tomorrow morning," he said. "Aldrete wants to do the commendation in front of the whole FOB. She thinks it is important for people to see." Teddy nodded. She understood what Aldrete was doing. The ceremony was not just about honoring one soldier. It was about making a statement that could not be ignored or forgotten. "Will you be there?" Kinnick smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him since before the mission. Would not miss it for the world. He left her to rest, and Teddy closed her eyes again. Tomorrow there would be ceremonies and speeches and the weight of public recognition. But tonight, there was only the quiet tent and the fading light and the knowledge that she had done something that mattered. On the table beside her, 2 bronze stars caught the last rays of the setting sun. 1 week later, Teddy stood at the edge of the canal and watched the sunset paint the water gold. She had asked to come back here, had requested the escort and the security and the time away from the FOB. Captain Aldrete had approved the request without question, understanding perhaps what Teddy herself was only beginning to grasp. Some things required witnessing. Some places demanded to be seen in daylight. The stone bridge rose before her, ancient and unchanged. Beneath it, the alcove where she had spent 11 hours was visible now, a dark hollow in the canal wall that looked far too small to have held a human body. She stared at it and tried to reconcile the space with her memory of those endless hours. It seemed impossible that she had survived. The water moved sluggishly past, the same water that had tried to kill her, and Teddy felt something shift in her chest. She had feared this place, had feared all water since she was 14 years old, since she had watched her father sink beneath the surface and disappear. The fear had lived inside her like a second heartbeat, constant and inescapable. But she had gone into the water anyway. She had stayed for 14 hours while it tried to claim her, and she had emerged. The fear was still there. She did not think it would ever fully leave. But it was quieter now, a whisper instead of scream. She had proven that she could carry it without letting it carry her. "Dad," she said softly, speaking to the water and the sky and the ghost of a man who had been gone for 15 years. "I did not drown. I stayed under until the mission was done." The water offered no response, but she had not expected one. She was not here for answers. She was here for closure. Kinnick appeared at her shoulder, silent as always. He had accompanied her on the trip, had stood watch while she made her private pilgrimage. Now he waited, giving her the space to find whatever she had come looking for. He would have been proud, she said. "My father. He always said the water was not the enemy." Kinnick nodded slowly. He was right. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade and the shadows lengthen. The checkpoint was visible in the distance, still manned but under new leadership now. Kasser's death had disrupted the insurgent cell, and intelligence suggested it would take them months to recover. Months during which American convoys would travel these roads a little safer. She thought about Diana Reyes, 22 years old, a Marine who had earned her place and paid the ultimate price. Teddy had requested information about her, had learned that she had been from Texas, that she had a younger sister who was now applying to the Naval Academy, that she had wanted to be a veterinarian after her service ended. Diana would never know that her death had been avenged, but her sister would know. Her family would know, and maybe, someday, that would matter. "We should head back," Kinnick said. "It will be dark soon." Teddy took one last look at the canal, at the bridge, at the alcove that had been her home and her prison. Then she turned and walked toward the waiting vehicle. The ceremony that morning had been everything Aldrete intended it to be. 200 soldiers standing at attention while the captain read the citation, her voice carrying across the formation with crisp authority. The bronze star with valor, pinned to Teddy's chest by Master Sergeant Cross, whose weathered face had worn an expression approaching reverence. She had not spoken during the ceremony, had not been expected to. But afterward, soldiers had approached her one by one. Some she knew, most she did not. They had shaken her hand or nodded or simply looked at her with something in their eyes that she was still learning to recognize. Respect, hard-earned and freely given. The female soldiers had been different. They had lingered after the others departed, forming a loose cluster around her that felt like sisterhood. A sergeant from the motor pool who had been fighting for a combat assignment for 3 years. A specialist from intelligence who dreamed of Ranger School. A lieutenant fresh from West Point who had been told by her own father that women had no place in the infantry. They had not asked for advice or inspiration. They had simply wanted to be near her to see with their own eyes the proof that the barriers were not unbreakable. Teddy had understood. She had been them once. She still was. The vehicle carried them back to FOB Copperhead as darkness settled over the Iraqi landscape. Teddy leaned her head against the window and watched the stars emerge, the same stars that had witnessed her crawl through black water toward an impossible shot. Kinnick broke the silence. What happens now? She considered the question. The Bronze Star would go on her record. The story would spread through the special operations community and beyond. Doors that had been closed would begin to open, not just for her, but for every woman who came after. Now I do it again, she said. Different mission, different target, same job. Kinnick smiled slightly. Same impossible odds? She returned the smile. Probably. The FOB gates appeared ahead, and the vehicle slowed for the security checkpoint. Teddy straightened in her seat, preparing to return to the world of briefings and equipment checks and the endless routine of war. But something had changed. She could feel it in the way people looked at her, in the weight of the metal on her chest, in the quiet confidence that had settled into her bones. She was not just Staff Sergeant Vashon anymore. She was proof of what was possible. The vehicle passed through the gates and rolled to a stop outside the operations building. Teddy stepped out into the warm night air and stood for a moment, breathing in the familiar sense of diesel and dust. Captain Aldretti was waiting for her. Vashon, she said, new mission brief in 30 minutes. We have a high-value target in Anbar province. Difficult insertion, long overwatch, challenging shot. Teddy felt the familiar surge of focus sharpening her mind. Parameters? Aldretti's eyes glinted with something that might have been anticipation. I think you'll find it interesting. She turned and walked toward the briefing room, and Teddy followed without hesitation. Behind her, the night stretched out over the desert, vast and dark and full of possibilities. Somewhere out there, another target waited. Another mission that others would call impossible. Another chance to prove that the only limits that mattered were the ones you refused to accept. Staff Sergeant Theodora Vashon had spent 14 hours in a canal and emerged as something new. Now she was ready to discover what that something could become. If you made it this far, thank you for listening to this story. Drop a comment and let us know your favorite part. Or tell us about someone in your life who showed the kind of strength that others said was impossible. We read every comment, and your support means everything.